December 23rd, 1941 Agno River, Luzon, the Philippines. The rain fell in sheets, warm and relentless, turning the jungle floor into a slick, sucking bog. Private First Class William Billy Kane adjusted his helmet as his squad crouched near the riverbank, their olive-drab uniforms soaked through. Mosquitoes swarmed their necks. Steam rose from the ground like breath from a sleeping beast. In his hands, Billy cradled something new, something most of the old-timers in the 31st Infantry scoffed at. It was short, it was light, and it didn't even look like a rifle. "It's a toy," one sergeant had muttered when they first saw it back at Fort McKinley. "A pea shooter," another laughed. "Better off with a Garand." The M1 Carbine, 30 caliber, semi-automatic, fed from a 15-round magazine, no recoil worth mentioning, and half the weight of the M1 Garand. Designed for support troops, truck drivers, radiomen, not real infantry. But nobody was laughing now. Across the river, movement flickered through the nipa palms. Japanese scouts silent, fast, crouching low in brown khaki with Arisaka rifles slung over their backs. They moved like ghosts, as if they owned this jungle. Some of them were laughing, too relaxed, unaware, until the Americans opened up. Billy pressed the butt of the carbine to his shoulder and squeezed the trigger. The weapon spat, fast and sharp. 3 shots in the time it took a Springfield to cycle once. One Japanese soldier jerked back with a scream, another dove into the mud. The rest scattered, returning fire with cracks and whines through the trees. The jungle exploded with sound. It wasn't like the open terrain of France in the Great War. Here, visibility ended at 20 feet. Firing positions were tight, covered in vines, roots, and creeping wet. Bolt-action rifles were slow and awkward. The Garand was better, but heavy. And after a mile of marching in tropical heat, every ounce mattered. Billy's carbine was different. He could raise it quick, shoot fast, move again. As the firefight raged across the river, a Japanese corporal crawled close, belly low to the mud, rifle bayonet fixed. Billy spotted him just in time, swung the carbine around, and fired point-blank the report like a firecracker in a coffin. The enemy crumpled. No time to think. No time to hesitate. Just keep moving. The squad regrouped as the enemy pulled back. The jungle quieted again, as it always did. The sound of flies returned. The steam rose again. The wounded moaned. And Billy looked down at the weapon in his hands. It wasn't pretty. It didn't have the punch of the Garand. But in the wet hell of Luzon's jungles, it had just saved his life. A few miles behind the line, at Japanese headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Shiro Nakajima reviewed the day's reports with a bored expression. "American firepower is weak," he muttered in Japanese, brushing aside the reports. "Their soldiers panic in close combat, their weapons ineffective." He had not yet heard of the weapon used in that ambush along the Agno River. But he would. The Imperial Japanese Army's doctrine was built on discipline, aggression, and the belief that the Allies were soft, untrained in jungle warfare, dependent on heavy machines. That assumption had held true in Malaya, in Singapore, in Java. But the jungles of Luzon were about to introduce something new, not just a weapon, but a shift in American infantry tactics. Fast movement, rapid fire, ambush, initiative, and the so-called jungle gun would be at the center of it. In the weeks that followed, reports began to filter through Japanese ranks. Unusual wounds at close range. Deadly bursts of fire that didn't match Thompson submachine guns or the slower bar. Units disappearing under sudden, precise attacks in thick underbrush. Yet captured equipment yielded nothing impressive, just a small carbine, barely more than a scaled-up pistol. "It's for clerks," one Japanese officer said dismissively. "It fires pistol rounds," another claimed incorrectly. They laughed, shrugged, dismissed it. But in foxholes, in ravines, in narrow trails choked by vines and wet leaves, their soldiers were dying, quickly, often before they could even aim. At a battered airfield outside Lingayen Gulf, a U.S. lieutenant stood over his troops during a lull between attacks. "You see this?" he said, holding up his own M1 Carbine. "You learn to trust this little bastard. Keep it clean, keep it close, and it'll get you home." The men nodded. They weren't laughing either. They were beginning to understand what the engineers back in the States had envisioned. A weapon that wasn't meant for trenches or parade grounds, but for this. Close, fast, brutal combat in terrain that punished the slow and rewarded the quick. And the enemy, those who still laughed, were learning the lesson one bullet at a time. January 3rd, 1942, near Ballet Pass, Luzon, Philippines. Rain hammered the canopy like endless drumfire. The jungle steamed and breathed, alive with insects, the smell of rot, and the faint metallic taste of cordite. Sergeant Frank D'Amico wiped his forehead, smeared with equal parts sweat and mud, and peered through the dripping ferns. His squad of the 31st Infantry was deep in the interior, now retreating south under constant harassment from Japanese patrols that seemed to materialize out of the mist. The order was to delay, not to win. Hold as long as possible, while MacArthur's forces withdrew to Bataan. But every mile was a fight. D'Amico crouched beside Private Kane, the same kid who'd fired that toy rifle back at the Ogno River days earlier. The M1 Carbine rested across Kane's knees, its Parkerized steel mottled with sweat and jungle grime. He had stopped calling it the pop gun. Now, he called it my lucky charm. Movement 3 o'clock, whispered D'Amico. Shapes slid between the palms, brown uniforms, the gleam of bayonets. The Japanese were advancing again, silent and disciplined, their Arisaka rifles held at the ready. They were veterans of China jungle fighters, ruthless and unafraid to close the distance. American doctrine taught firing from cover. Japanese doctrine favored the bayonet charge. But this wasn't Nanking. This was the Philippines. And the Americans weren't breaking this time. Kane pressed the carbine tight to his shoulder and took a breath. When the first Japanese soldier stepped into view, he fired 3 times in rapid succession. The gun's action cycling smoothly, the muzzle flash strobing through the ferns. The enemy dropped instantly. D'Amico followed with his Garand. Corporal Red Thomas lobbed a grenade down the trail. The blast ripped through the jungle leaves and branches fluttered down like rain. The Japanese responded in kind grenades, wild shouting, the rising roar of "Banzai" echoing through the fog. The sound was ancient, primal, and terrifying. "Hold your line," D'Amico bellowed. "Don't you move." The enemy surged forward. Kane reloaded, slammed a new magazine home, and fired again, his shots quick, precise, surgical. He wasn't spraying like a Thompson gunner. He was slicing the charge apart, one man at a time. The light weight of the carbine made it possible to track fast-moving targets without losing aim. Even in the chaos, even under the scream of bullets, his movements were fluid: left, right, duck, fire again. The M1 Carbine wasn't made for stopping power at long range. But at 20 yards, 30 yards, it was lethal. A whisper in the vines, a snap of light, a dead man falling. By noon, the charge had broken. The Japanese pulled back into the mist, dragging their wounded. The Americans were bloodied but alive. The men looked at one another, half in disbelief, half in exhaustion. D'Amico spat into the mud. "Hell of a rifle for a clerk's gun," he muttered. They didn't know it, but similar stories were spreading across the Pacific in New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons. Reports spoke of a new weapon the Japanese couldn't quite classify. Some mistook it for a cut-down Garand. Others thought it was a submachine gun. But the results were the same: devastating at short range, quick to handle, and unstoppable when wielded by men fighting for their lives in tangled green hell. Back at a field workshop near Baton, mechanics worked feverishly to keep the carbines operational. The humidity corroded metal overnight. Magazines rusted. Bolts jammed if left uncleaned for a single day. Yet soldiers guarded their carbines like relics. When ammunition ran low, they scavenged magazines from the dead. Some troops carved grips to fit their hands better. Others wrapped the stocks in cloth to prevent slippage. It wasn't standard issue for frontline riflemen, not yet, but word was spreading fast. Quartermasters couldn't keep up with demand. Even officers were requesting them, trading their pistols for carbines wherever possible. One colonel reportedly said, "It's the first thing that doesn't feel like it's fighting me in this damned jungle." Meanwhile, Japanese command continued to underestimate it. Reports filed from the 14th Army labeled it as an American semi-automatic carbine of little power. One intelligence officer even wrote, "It appears to be for training or self-defense purposes. They would learn differently soon enough." By February, the Americans had fallen back into the Bataan Peninsula, a narrow strip of land jutting into Manila Bay. Supplies were low, food, ammunition, medicine all running out. Men were sick with malaria, dysentery, exhaustion. Yet morale was not broken. They were dug in, hidden in the green, and determined to make the enemy pay for every inch. It was there that the carbine truly came into its own. In the close confines of Bataan's ravines and narrow trails, the Garan's long barrel snagged on vines. The Thompson was heavy and burned through precious .45 ammo. The carbine, though quick to shoulder, light to carry, became the weapon of choice for jungle ambushes. Japanese soldiers began to whisper about the little American rifle. They reported hearing rapid bursts, not the staccato of a submachine gun, but something sharper, cleaner. Scouts found their comrades dead, with small-caliber entry wounds, no time to fire back. In early March, during a night raid near the Lamau River, a Japanese platoon attempted to infiltrate an American command post. They crept silently under the moonlight. No flashlights, no sound but their own breathing. But the Americans were ready. A dozen carbines opened up at once, their synchronized bursts flashing through the palm leaves like lightning. The jungle came alive with death. When dawn came, 24 enemy bodies lay scattered among the roots. Not one American had fallen. A captured Japanese officer later admitted under interrogation, "We thought your men carried only pistols in the jungle. We were wrong, very wrong." By April, the fighting had turned hopeless. Bataan was collapsing. The men were starving, ammunition gone. But those who survived remembered that, in the final days, one weapon had given them a chance, one that had been mocked, belittled, and laughed at before the first shot was fired. The little jungle gun had earned its respect. And as the Philippines fell, its legend was only beginning. August 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The surf was boiling with landing craft. Rain swept across the dark water in silver sheets, mingling with the smoke from burning fuel drums. It was 0910 hours when the first Marines of the 1st Division stormed ashore at Red Beach, Guadalcanal. They expected heavy resistance, but for now, the jungle stood silent, brooding, watching. Among the assault troops was Corporal James Hawk Henderson, a wiry kid from Kansas who carried something few Marines had yet seen in combat, the M1 Carbine. The rifle had arrived almost by accident, a handful issued to communications men and officers. But Henderson had traded his sidearm for one aboard the transport ship. "If I'm going into a jungle," he'd told his sergeant, "I'm not bringing a damn pistol." Now, slogging through knee-deep muck, he cradled the carbine under his poncho. At 5.2 pounds, it felt almost too light, like something you'd use for target practice, not invasion. The walnut stock was slick with sea spray, but the gun sat naturally in his grip. The bolt action clicked clean, the magazine locked tight. 15 rounds of .30 carbine ammunition, enough to buy you time when the trees start shooting back. As the Marines pushed inland toward the airfield, later known as Henderson Field, they began to realize what they were up against. The jungle was not a backdrop. It was the enemy's ally. It muffled sound, devoured visibility, and turned movement into a nightmare. Men disappeared yards away. Every rustle could be a bird or a bayonet team. The first shots came at dusk. Sniper fire from the tree line. Short bursts from Arisaka rifles, then silence. The Japanese had melted back into the undergrowth before the Marines could pinpoint them. Henderson's platoon took cover among the palm trunks, the sweat on their faces streaked with red mud. "Keep low," the sergeant hissed. "They're testing our line." Minutes passed like hours. Then, from the shadows, came the low chant of "Tenno Haika Banzai," and the night erupted. Grenades burst in white flashes. Muzzle fire strobed through the rain. Japanese troops poured out of the foliage in a screaming wave, their bayonets glinting in the lightning flashes. Henderson dropped to one knee, shouldered his carbine, and began firing. The weapon answered with crisp, rapid bursts, crack, 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 faster than any Garand around him. Each shot found its mark. The light weight let him pivot and fire without losing rhythm. 15 rounds vanished in seconds, but the reload was smooth. Slap, pull, click, ready again. Marines nearby had to pause after 8 rounds to reload their Garands. Henderson kept firing, his muzzle flashing in the storm like a heartbeat. The carbine didn't kick, it danced. When the charge broke, the jungle went dead again. Only the rain remained. Dozens of Japanese bodies littered the clearing, many cut down before reaching 20 yards. Henderson's magazine pouches were empty, his knuckles white around the weapon's stock. "Hell," he muttered breathless, "that thing sings." The M1 Carbine wasn't supposed to be on the front lines. It was meant for cooks, engineers, artillerymen, soldiers who didn't need full rifles. But Guadalcanal changed that overnight. The Marines quickly learned what the weapons designers at Winchester had envisioned: a bridge between pistol and rifle, built for speed, not brute force. In the weeks that followed, carbines began spreading like wildfire through the ranks. Men traded favors and supplies to get them. When supply ships arrived, carbines vanished within hours. They were light enough to carry alongside grenades and extra rations, and they made patrolling bearable in heat that turned rifle barrels too hot to touch. But for every Marine who praised it, there was another who doubted it. "It's no Garand," grumbled Sergeant Frank Blythe, spitting tobacco juice into the mud. "You hit a Jap with a 30-06, he stays down. You hit him with that pea shooter, he just gets mad." Henderson heard the complaints but didn't argue. He'd seen what the carbine could do when used right quick. Aimed fire, center mass. The key wasn't stopping power. It was accuracy and control. You could shoot fast without flinching, and that meant more rounds on target. Japanese officers soon took notice, too. Patrols reported new American machine carbines appearing in the jungle short, black weapons firing small bullets in fast bursts. They underestimated it again. "The weapon is for junior officers," one report concluded. "Its power is weak. Approach boldly." That mistake would cost them dearly. By late September, the Japanese launched a full-scale counterattack to retake the airfield. Thousands of troops poured from the jungle at night, shouting their war cries under the thunder of naval bombardment. The 1st Marine Division held firm, exhausted, outnumbered, and filthy. Henderson and his men dug in near the edge of Henderson Field itself, behind sandbags and wrecked fuel drums. The rain turned the ground to sludge. The Japanese came in waves, their silhouettes flickering in the muzzle flashes. Henderson's carbine cracked again and again, the action running flawlessly even in the mud. When his sergeant's Garand jammed, Henderson handed him his spare magazine and kept firing. A grenade went off, close dirt showered over them. "You good?" the sergeant yelled. "Still singin'," Henderson shouted back. At dawn, when the firing finally ceased, the airfield was still American. Over 600 Japanese lay dead before the Marine perimeter. Henderson's unit had taken 9 casualties, most from mortars, not rifles. The after-action report noted something curious. M1 Carbine performance, excellent in close combat and patrol conditions. Superior handling in jungle terrain. Troops request additional issue. By October, requests had turned into orders. Production ramped up stateside. Factories in Michigan and Massachusetts worked day and night to meet demand. Winchester couldn't do it alone. IBM, Inland, and General Motors joined in, each building thousands of carbines a week. In less than a year, over 800,000 would roll off American assembly lines. A weapon that started as a sidearm replacement had become the Pacific's most coveted tool for survival. Yet, for every success on Guadalcanal, new horrors loomed ahead: darker jungles, fiercer resistance. The Japanese were adapting, learning, and when the M1 Carbine reached the Philippines again 3 years later, the laughter that once echoed through the trees would be replaced by something else entirely: fear. The war was changing, and the jungle gun was about to earn its name all over again. October 20th, 1944, Leyte Gulf, Eastern Visayas, Philippines. The roar of naval guns shook the coast. Shells howled overhead, tearing into the jungle with blinding flashes. Palm trees snapped like matchsticks. Pillars of smoke rose where Japanese bunkers had once stood. Off the beaches, the sea was choked with American warships, battleships, cruisers, LSTs, and wave after wave of Higgins boats, all unloading men and machines with unstoppable rhythm. General Douglas MacArthur, tall, pipe clenched in his teeth, and eyes locked on the smoke ahead, stepped off the landing craft onto the sand near Red Beach. The flashbulbs popped. His famous promise had come full circle. "I shall return." And behind him came the tide. Among the first ashore were men of the 7th Infantry Division, grim and soaked, pushing into the scorched vegetation with bayonets fixed and eyes wary. Sergeant Joe Morales of Company F adjusted the sling of his M1 Carbine as his boots hit the surf. It was the second war he'd fought. The first had been in the mountains of Luzon, back in '42, where he'd lost half his platoon and all his illusions. Now he was back. Older, harder, and armed with the same weapon he had trusted in the jungles of Bataan. He looked around and grunted. "Smells the same," he muttered to no one. Behind him, his squad advanced through tangled vines and mud-slicked trails, the air heavy with smoke and the faint coppery scent of blood. The Japanese were here well dug, silent, and waiting. They no longer underestimated the American jungle rifles. Now they feared them. It didn't take long. By noon, a Japanese machine gun nest opened fire from a concealed position in a thicket overlooking a ravine. Morales hit the ground hard, cursing as rounds cracked overhead. His point man, a private from Arkansas, had already been hit, sprawled face down in the mud. 2 o'clock, 20 yards, Morales barked. Base of the palm. He pivoted, dropping to a knee, and brought up the carbine. The muzzle snapped with a trio of sharp cracks, pop, 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 and the gunner went silent. Morales crawled forward, signaling his fire team. The carbine's light frame allowed quick, agile movement, perfect for flanking through the vines. No long barrel to catch on roots, no brutal recoil to slow follow-up shots. The Marines clearing the other flank were slower, burdened by bars and garans, great for firepower, but clumsy in this maze of foliage. Morales and his men moved like fish through reeds. In a clearing, a Japanese corporal leapt from cover with a bayonet. Morales didn't think. The carbine fired once. The man fell mid-lunge. When the firefight died down, his men exhaled, filthy and shaking. Morales reloaded and looked to the wounded private. "Still breathing," someone said. "Just winged." "Lucky bastard," Morales replied. "Get him out of here." That night, the jungle didn't sleep. Japanese soldiers slipped through the trees, probing lines, whispering in the dark. Morales sat in the mud, the carbine resting across his lap like a trusted companion. The men called it the sweetheart, or Betty, or the one that listens. It was becoming more than just a weapon. It was survival. Farther north, on the slopes of Katman Hill, a brutal firefight was unfolding. Units from the 96th Infantry Division were caught in a 3-sided ambush near a ridge trail. Visibility was zero. Japanese troops used spider holes, log bunkers, and false trails to encircle American patrols. Lieutenant Arthur Blake, fresh from training at Fort Benning, led his platoon into the green trap. His voice barely rose above the gunfire. "Fire discipline! Pairs of 3! Don't spray!" His carbine was already warm in his hands and accurate. Where Garand's took precious seconds to reacquire targets, the carbine's lightweight design let him snap shoot with deadly rhythm. He ducked a burst of machine gun fire, rolled, and fired 3 rounds into the side of the nest. Screams followed, but not every shot was a kill. The .30 carbine round, moving at just under 2,000 feet per second, sometimes lacked the punch to drop a charging soldier with one hit, especially when drugged on amphetamines or charging with sheer will. "Sir, he's still coming!" shouted a corporal, panicked, as a wounded Japanese sergeant staggered forward, bleeding from the chest. Blake stepped in front and fired again, 2 rounds center mass, 1 to the throat. The body dropped. "You just have to know where to place them," Blake said quietly. "This isn't about stopping power. It's about control." That lesson would spread through the islands from Leyte to Samar, and soon, to Luzon once again. Soldiers learned to double tap, to aim low, to fire quick. The carbine was a tool of finesse in a war of brutality. By late November, MacArthur's men had pushed deep into Leyte's interior. Carbine-equipped units formed the tip of patrols, flanking positions, chasing fleeing enemies through ravines. They fired from behind tree trunks, over roots, and inside pitch-black tunnels. They didn't need to lug extra pounds of rifle steel through jungle heat. The carbine was fast, accurate, and quiet enough to kill before the echo could bounce. Still, not all opinions were glowing. "It's not a damn rifle," one tank commander complained. "You want to scare off squirrels, great. But if you want to kill a man charging with a sword, better pray you're close." He had a point. The carbine wasn't for long-range engagements. It wasn't built to punch through walls or helmets at 300 yards. But in the Pacific, few fights happened at those distances. Most occurred at 10 paces. In those conditions, the M1 Carbine was poetry, fast, surgical, precise. And when Luzon finally beckoned again, and the final battle for the Philippines began, it would be the carbines, not just the tanks or howitzers, leading the way through the vines. This time, the Japanese would not laugh. They would run. January 12th, 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The mountains trembled. Artillery roared from the ridge lines behind American lines as the 6th Army surged inland from Lingayen Gulf. The dirt roads leading south toward Manila were a broken ribbon of craters, shattered trees, and bloated corpses. Every foot of progress was paid in blood, and every mile closed the noose on the Japanese forces digging into the capital. Sergeant Joe Morales was back in Luzon, the same man who'd fought through Leyte, now grizzled and 30 pounds lighter than when he first set foot on Philippine soil in 1942. His M1 carbine rode against his chest like a second spine, coated in jungle grime, the wood chipped from months of war. He no longer called it a rifle. It was just the answer. His squad had orders. Push up Highway 3, clear the villages northeast of Tarlac, and secure the flanks for the main thrust to Manila. Intelligence said the enemy was scattered desperate remnants of the 14th Area Army, but Morales had heard that lie before. They approached the town of Bamban through a grove of banana trees. The sky was gray, the air sticky and hot despite the calendar. Morales crouched at the head of the column, peering through binoculars. Nothing moved. He signaled forward. The moment the first boots hit the edge of the village, machine guns opened up from concealed positions in nipa huts and drainage ditches. Japanese defenders, not broken stragglers, but hardened holdouts, poured fire down the narrow lane, cutting down 2 men before they hit the ground. "Ambush! Left flank!" Morales roared, diving behind a stone wall as bullets cracked overhead. His squad fanned out, returning fire where they could. Most of the Garand men had no line of sight, their rifles too long for the tight alleyways and brush-choked yards. But Morales? He was in his element. He crept low, carbine tucked tight under his arm, and maneuvered around a bombed-out shack. A flash of movement, a Japanese rifleman reloading in a doorway, and Morales fired. 3 rounds, mid-torso. The man folded without a sound. Another popped up behind a cooking barrel. Morales dropped prone, fired twice, then rolled aside as bullets chipped the ground where he'd been. By now, his men were rallying. A bar team laid down suppressive fire while Morales crawled closer. He slid through a garden, thorns tearing at his sleeves, until he came within 10 yards of a sandbag nest manned by 2 Japanese machine gunners. No grenades left. He raised the carbine, held his breath, and squeezed off 4 shots in a controlled arc. Both gunners slumped over their weapon. The firing stopped. The village was theirs. When the medics came to pull the dead, Morales just sat on the steps of a ruined chapel, staring at his hands. One was bleeding from a cut on the knuckle, but he hadn't noticed. The carbine sat beside him, silent now, its barrel warm. "I've carried her since Bataan," he muttered. "I'll bury her in Tokyo if I have to." Word was spreading across the front, not just in Morales' unit, but through the 37th, the 1st Cavalry, the 6th Infantry. The M1 Carbine was earning a reputation. Light enough to carry while climbing mountains, short enough to wield in house-to-house fighting, accurate enough for ambushes and counter-ambushes. In the days that followed, the Americans pushed deeper into the Central Plains. Japanese resistance stiffened the closer they got to Manila. Fanatical rear guards, some high on methamphetamines, others simply refusing to surrender, launched night attacks with swords and grenades. Dozens of American lives were saved, only by the quick reflexes of soldiers armed with carbines. At a river crossing near Cabanatuan, a scout platoon was caught in an ambush from a tree line above the bank. A 19-year-old private from Illinois, armed only with a carbine, took down 4 attackers in 10 seconds, firing from the hip while pulling a wounded comrade out of the water. His citation read, "Displayed exceptional speed and accuracy under fire, aided by effective use of lightweight semi-automatic rifle." Even Filipino guerrillas, the unsung shadows of the Pacific, began to seek out the carbine. Its portability made it ideal for hit-and-run tactics, especially in mountainous jungle terrain. In Baguio and Nueva Ecija, locals ambushed Japanese convoys using stolen or gifted M1 carbines, then vanished into the hills before the enemy could react. But still, the weapon wasn't perfect. A night patrol near the town of San Fernando ended in disaster when a Japanese charge broke through the lines. One soldier fired 6 rounds into a charging officer, 2 to the chest, 1 to the arm, and still the man kept coming, his bayonet piercing the American side before he finally dropped. "The bullet's too damn light," the wounded man gasped later. "You gotta hit bone, or they just don't stop." Command took note. Warnings were circulated. Fire in pairs, aim for vital zones, and don't let the lightness of the weapon lull you into overconfidence. But those who knew it best understood it was a weapon for fast hands and cool heads. It wasn't brute force, it was finesse. And in the tangle of Luzon, finesse often meant survival. By February, American forces were nearing the outskirts of Manila. The once glorious capital was now a walled tomb turned into a fortress by the desperate and cruel. The carbine would soon be tested in ways it had never been before. Street-to-street combat, room-to-room clearing, point-blank engagements in cathedrals and courtyards soaked in fire. And as Morales loaded fresh magazines into his ammo pouch, wiping the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand, he looked down the road toward the rising smoke over Manila and whispered, "She's brought me this far. Let's see if we make it through the gates." February 9th, 1945. Intramuros. District, Manila. The old Spanish walls of Intramuros stood blackened by fire. Where once they had repelled pirates and insurgents, now they crumbled under American artillery. The ancient heart of Manila was being crushed, not by time, but by war. 1,000 fires burned at once. Columns of black smoke curled into the sky. Children cried in the rubble. Dogs barked endlessly. The smell of cordite, sewage, blood, and diesel clung to the skin like a curse. For Sergeant Joe Morales and his squad, it was the worst fighting they had ever seen. "Jesus," muttered Private Ellis as they crouched behind a gutted trolley car. They turned the whole city into a damn trap. And it was true. The Japanese 31st Naval Special Base Force, desperate, cornered, and fanatical, had turned Manila into a fortress of death. Buildings were rigged with booby traps. Every alley had a sniper. Every house could be a tomb. The enemy fought with the fury of men who expected no mercy and gave none. Morales signaled his men forward. The street ahead, Calianda, was a killing zone. Mortar fragments littered the sidewalks. The upper floors of once beautiful colonial buildings hung like torn paper. Somewhere inside, machine guns waited. The Americans couldn't shell the area indiscriminately. Too many civilians were still trapped. So they went in. House to house, floor by floor, room by goddamned room. The M1 Carbine was no longer just a jungle rifle. It had become the scalpel for urban warfare, light enough to swing around doorframes, small enough to fire in stairwells, fast enough to shoot twice before the enemy got one shot off. They entered the first building, weapons raised. Morales led, the carbine tight to his shoulder. The first room was empty, overturned furniture, a dead woman on the floor, her rosary still clenched in hand. The next door opened into a kitchen and 2 Japanese soldiers exploded from behind the cabinets, bayonets flashing. Morales fired point blank. 2 shots. The first caught one in the chest. The second found the other's throat. The carbine's stock cracked hard against the dead man's helmet as Morales shoved the body aside. No time to process, no time to breathe. The next house, the next room, the next doorway. In a cramped living room, a Japanese machine gun nest opened fire through a shattered window, pinning Morales's fire team behind a collapsed armoire. Bullets chewed the wall like termites. "We can't flank," yelled Corporal Adams. "No space." Morales glanced at the wall, thin, termite-eaten wood. He pointed to it. "Shoot through it." He raised his carbine and fired. The others joined him, not aiming at the window, but at the wall itself. The 30 carbine rounds punched through the cheap paneling. Screams followed, then silence. The carbine was never meant to pierce armor. But plaster, bamboo, rotted wood, it tore through with lethal precision. By midday, the squad had cleared 7 buildings, 5 civilians rescued, 9 enemy soldiers killed. Morales had emptied 14 magazines. His hands were blistered from heat and recoil. The stock of his carbine was scorched at the edge from a close grenade blast. The enemy wasn't just holding ground, they were committing atrocities. In a convent near San Agustin Church, Morales's squad found the aftermath of a massacre. Women and children executed in a line, nuns raped and bayoneted. Japanese soldiers had barricaded the exits and lit fires before retreating. The squad didn't speak. They simply reloaded. They fought harder after that. The carbine, light and compact, gave them the edge they needed in the close confines of Manila's death traps. Morales could raise and fire it faster than any bolt-action rifle. He could climb rubble with one hand, carbine in the other. He could lay flat and still shoot accurately beneath furniture or collapsed roofs. And it wasn't just Americans using it now. Filipino guerrillas, joining the battle as the city burned, carried, captured, or donated M1 carbines. One freedom fighter, calling himself Santos, fought alongside Morales during a raid on a fortified school. He moved like a wraith through the ruins, his carbine firing bursts from windows and balconies. Later, Morales asked him how long he'd been fighting. "Since the Japs took my brother in 1942, Santos replied. "This rifle, she speaks for him now." In one daring night assault, Morales' unit crossed the Pasig River under covering fire, moving by boat and footbridge to flank Japanese positions in the Paco district. The carbine was silent enough to avoid drawing fire if used with discipline. Its 15 rounds gave each soldier the chance to neutralize multiple targets quickly before needing to reload. As they moved through the shell-scarred library of the University of the Philippines, Morales spotted a Japanese officer trying to destroy field papers. He shot him once through the spine, the carbine barked, and the man collapsed mid-motion, ink splattering the wall with his blood. By February 20th, the Battle of Manila was nearing its climax. The Americans had encircled the old walled city of Intramuros. Japanese resistance had turned suicidal. Banzai charges against tanks. Snipers firing until their buildings collapsed around them. Children used as human shields. And yet Morales' squad pushed on. Every bullet they fired was precise. Every corridor was cleared with discipline. And always, always, that same unmistakable rhythm echoed through the streets. Pup, pup, pup. Click. Pup, pup, pup. The carbine was no longer a joke, no longer a support weapon. It was the American rifle of the Pacific Street War, forged in the jungle, perfected in the ruins of a dying city. And as Morales stood in the smoke-choked courtyard of Fort Santiago, the last Japanese machine gun nest silenced, he looked at his men, all alive, all exhausted, and raised his carbine one last time. "She brought us through hell," he said. "Let's hope we don't need her in heaven." February 24th, 1945, Fort Santiago, Manila. The gunfire finally stopped. After nearly a month of ceaseless urban slaughter, the sounds that had defined February in Manila, cracking carbines, crumbling walls, screaming shells, and shrieking men, gave way to a dreadful silence. The kind of silence that clung to you, pressed into your ears like damp cloth, and made you afraid to breathe. The last Japanese pockets inside Fort Santiago had been wiped out just hours earlier. Bodies lay in the stone corridors and cellars, some burned, some riddled, others slumped where they had chosen suicide over surrender. American infantry and Filipino guerrillas now wandered the compound slowly, rifles lowered, expressions blank. Even the jungle birds had gone quiet. Sergeant Joe Morales sat with his back against a moss-covered wall inside the courtyard. His M1 Carbine lay across his lap, dirty, blood-smeared, and empty. A cigarette hung from his lips, unlit. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there. He couldn't remember the last time he blinked. Nearby, a medic wrapped a dressing around Corporal Adams' thigh. "We got through it, Sarge," Adams mumbled, his voice dry. All the way through, but Morales wasn't looking at him. His eyes were locked on the river, where the sun filtered through smoke in thin golden shafts. Manila burned in the distance, but for the first time in weeks, no enemy came charging from the smoke. No snipers fired from bell towers. No civilians screamed beneath crumbling walls. It was over. At least, here. But the silence brought no comfort. That day, Morales finally disassembled the carbine he had carried since Leyte. His hands, moved by instinct, pushed the takedown pin, slide off the barrel group, pull the bolt. It was a ritual now, as familiar as prayer. He cleaned it slowly with oil from a torn rag, black grit staining his fingers. He didn't speak as he worked. When he was done, he loaded a fresh magazine. He didn't expect to fire it that day, but the weight of a full mag gave him comfort. It made him feel like he still had some control in a world where nothing made sense anymore. That same week, in another part of Manila, Private First Class Thomas Egan stood beside a pit behind a school in Ermita. Inside were the bodies of over 70 civilians, teachers, mothers, children, some shot, others burned, all dumped like trash by retreating Japanese soldiers. Egan's face was still. He had seen death before, but not this, not like this. He looked down at the M1 carbine in his hands. He remembered the day he first received it back in California, on a firing range where instructors had chuckled about the little rifle. They said it was for clerks. They said it wouldn't stop a charging man. They said he'd be better off with a Garand. But here, in Manila, the carbine had saved his life more times than he could count, and it had taken many others. He remembered firing through smoke-filled hallways, remembered clearing classrooms where enemy soldiers waited behind desks, remembered firing point-blank into the chest of a man who'd leapt at him with a blade. He remembered how fast the weapon cycled, how easy it was to reload, how light it felt in his arms as he ran through flame. But now, holding it here, near this pit, he didn't feel light. He felt heavy. A chaplain walked past him, crossing himself. "Don't blame the rifle, son," the man said gently, pausing beside Egan. "It only does what you ask it to." Elsewhere, in a temporary command post near the ruins of the Manila Cathedral, General Walter Kruger of the 6th Army read the latest combat reports with weary eyes. M1 Carbine performance in Manila. Exemplary in confined urban terrain. Superior speed of engagement. Lethality remains dependent on shot placement. He underlined those last 5 words with his pencil. The brass still debated the weapon. Some claimed it lacked stopping power. Some wanted an improved cartridge. Some praised it as the greatest infantry weapon of the war. But the soldiers weren't debating anymore. They had already voted with their lives. The same day, at a beachhead south of the city, reinforcements came ashore. Fresh-faced boys from Texas and Iowa stepped off landing craft, rifles slung over nervous shoulders. A few carried M1 Garands. But more and more, they held carbines newly issued, fresh from the factories of General Motors in Winchester. Some laughed at how light it was. Some tapped the stock, uncertain. And others looked around the wreckage of Manila and said nothing at all. By nightfall, Sergeant Morales had moved deeper into the city. The army had begun its final push to clear the last pockets of resistance in the suburbs. Morales's squad bivouacked inside what had once been a theater. The velvet curtains hung in scorched tatters. Bullet holes stitched across the stage. Seats were splintered and burned. Morales leaned against the box office booth, watching his men sleep under the fading mural of a 1,930 seconds film star. The carbine lay across his chest. He thought about the men it had killed, the men it had saved. He remembered its bark in the jungle of Bataan, its cry in the alleys of Manila. its steel warmth in his arms when he needed it most. Was it perfect? No. Was it enough? Damn right it was, he whispered. The war wasn't over yet. There was still Okinawa, still Iwo Jima, and the specter of an invasion of Japan itself. But for now, at least for this one night, Morales closed his eyes and slept with the silence. March 9th, 1945. Balit Pass, Luzon, northern Philippines. The mountains were treacherous. Steep slopes, knife-edged ridges, and clouds that clung like ghosts to the cliffs. Every turn in the trail could be a kill zone, every rock concealing a dug-in machine gun. This was not the jungle of Leyte or the streets of Manila. This was a different kind of hell, colder, quieter, higher. Balit Pass, also known to the Americans as Bloody Balete, stood between the U.S. 25th Infantry Division and the Cagayan Valley, where the last significant formations of the Japanese 14th Area Army clung to hope. Taking this pass would mean cracking open the northern Luzon defenses and cutting off retreating units, but the cost would be steep. Sergeant Joe Morales knew that already. His platoon was advancing up a switchback trail, gouged into the mountain by monsoon rains and artillery fire. The wind was sharp and dry. The only sound was the crunch of boots on gravel and the distant howl of the wind through pine trees. Unlike Manila, where buildings hemmed you in and fire came from windows, here death came from above, from ridges, rocks, and ravines. Morales's M1 Carbine was slung across his front, barrel down. The mountain trails made the Garand unwieldy. Even the Thompson was too heavy for men hauling packs and climbing slopes. The carbine, once mocked for its small size, had become the standard in this terrain. It was light enough to carry while scaling rocks, short enough to fire while crouched in cover, and accurate enough to hit a man at 100 yards if you had a steady hand, which Morales did. Ahead, scouts signaled fist up, then a flat hand. Contact. The column froze. Through the mist, movement flickered dark shapes along the ridge, then flashes of gunfire. Japanese defenders opened up with machine guns and grenades, their positions entrenched into the very bones of the mountain. "Ambush! Up the ridge!" Morales shouted, dropping to one knee. The carbine came up, smooth and instinctive. Crack! 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 The sound echoed strangely off the rock walls, crisp and fast. Morales fired a burst at a muzzle flash near a fallen tree. The shooter vanished. "Covering fire!" he yelled as his men scattered into rocky depressions. The bar team laid down fire as Morales and two others flanked left, crawling up a side ravine. A grenade tumbled down the slope. Morales rolled behind a boulder as it exploded, showering him with shards of stone. His ears rang. He tasted blood in his mouth, but his hands still worked. He stood, braced, aimed and fired, 3 shots into a sniper's nest cut into a tree trunk. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of the enemy pulling back, repositioning, preparing another kill zone farther up the mountain. Morales knew the pattern by now. They would bleed the Americans one trail at a time, delay them, exhaust them, not win, just deny victory. But they hadn't counted on the carbine. Later that day, Morales's platoon reached a ravine too narrow for tanks and too exposed for artillery. Japanese machine gunners were entrenched in concrete bunkers salvaged from old Spanish colonial defenses. They had overlapping arcs of fire and perfect elevation. Morales and a corporal crawled forward under the cover of darkness, inch by inch, across loose gravel and pine needles. At 15 yards, the corporal tossed a smoke grenade. Morales stood fast and fired into the slit of the nearest bunker as the smoke billowed. 3 rounds, 1 into the viewport, 2 into the firing slit. A scream, then nothing. They cleared the rest with grenades and bayonets. When they pulled the Japanese dead from the bunker, one soldier still clutched an Arisaka bolt-action rifle, a weapon longer and heavier than Morales's entire carbine. "They didn't stand a chance in this kind of fight," the corporal muttered. Morales didn't answer. He was looking at the carbine's front sight post. It had chipped slightly on a rock, still zeroed, still ready. Across the valley, a Filipino guerrilla unit under Captain Emilio Reyes fought a parallel war. His men, many armed with M1 carbines dropped by supply planes, harassed Japanese convoys, destroyed supply caches, and ambushed fleeing officers. In one skirmish near the village of Aratao, Reya's men used carbines to eliminate an entire Japanese command team within 30 seconds fast, accurate, and without alerting nearby patrols. "These are not toys," Reyes said later. "They are the blades we've waited 3 years to hold." Back on the ridge, Morales' platoon spent the night in foxholes dug between tree roots. The sky was a velvet dome filled with stars. Somewhere down the slope, Japanese mortars thumped dully. Adams leaned back against a rock, cleaning his weapon. "You ever think about what we'd do without these things?" Morales glanced over. The carbine sat on his lap, bolt locked open, magazine half full. "I'd be dead 4 times over," he replied. "So would you." "I used to think it was weak," Adams muttered. "But I've never fired anything faster. Or cleaner. It just works." "That's the trick," Morales said, pulling the bolt closed. "It works. Doesn't matter what they say in Washington or what they write in those reports. Out here, you're either fast or you're buried." By dawn, the push toward the summit resumed. The Americans would take Balit Pass, eventually inch by inch, crater by crater. The cost would be hundreds of lives. But every soldier who climbed that cursed mountain carried with them the same tool, the jungle gun, turned mountain rifle. Lightweight, fast, unassuming, and in the most unforgiving terrain of the Pacific, it was proving itself all over again. April 17th, 1945, Cordillera Mountains, northern Luzon. The wind howled across the ridgelines like a warning. Above 4,000 feet, the jungle thinned into pine forest, and the sun fell sharp and pale on the cracked red soil. What remained of General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 14th Area Army had gone to ground in these mountains, tens of thousands of Japanese troops scattered across caves, ridges, and makeshift tunnels in a final, fanatical refusal to surrender. It wasn't a conventional battle anymore. It was pursuit, extraction, extermination, and it was being fought one firefight at a time. Sergeant Joe Morales, now emaciated from months in the field and ringed with lines around his eyes, stepped carefully across a slippery rock ledge, his boots caked in dust. Below him, a ravine cut into the earth like a scar, choked with brambles and bamboo. His carbine hung across his chest, loaded, safety off. The M1 Garans had long been left behind. The terrain wouldn't allow them. Ammunition was limited, water was scarce. Every ounce mattered. Only the carbines had followed them this far. Morales moved in silence. His squad was down to 8 men. The rest were gone, killed, wounded, rotated out. He didn't know the names of the replacements anymore. He didn't have the energy to learn them. They called the last phase of the Luzon campaign the mop-up, as if it were routine. It wasn't. The Japanese weren't surrendering. They were vanishing into rock shelters and reappearing at night to strike. Earlier that week, a machine gun team was found dismembered in a ravine, their own grenades used against them. Another patrol had gone missing in a cave system near Kiangan. No remains were ever found. Morales had seen one man bayoneted while taking a piss at dawn. This wasn't war. It was hunting. And being hunted, at 1,300 hours, Morales and his squad reached a cluster of abandoned huts near the slope of Mount Pulag. The structures were eerily untouched, cooking pots still on the stones, blankets laid neatly. "Tunayat," he signaled. "Stop." Something wasn't right. He scanned the trees. A glint metal. Motion. Then, crack. A shot rang out from the underbrush. Private Lowell dropped instantly, blood pouring from his neck. "Contact right," Morales bellowed, dropping to the ground behind a gnarled root. The Japanese opened fire from concealed spider holes and trees, shouting like phantoms. Bullets hissed through the clearing, chewing apart the huts. Morales rolled left and fired 3 shots toward the muzzle flash. His carbine answered without hesitation. Light, fast, accurate. Another soldier followed, spraying suppressive fire. "Flank them!" Morales shouted. 2 left, up the ridge." The squad split. The carbines gave them speed they could move under fire, shoot without bracing, fire while ducking and crawling. In terrain like this, the Garand would have been an anchor. The Thompson would have run out of ammo too fast. But the carbine, it moved like thought. Morales reached a downed tree and rested his elbow. A Japanese rifleman stood to reload. Morales dropped him with 2 quick shots, then ducked again. Seconds stretched like wire. Another enemy charged through the clearing with a sword. The squad's youngest replacement panicked, firing wildly, missing. Morales stood up and took the shot clean, center mass. The man fell face first into the brush. When it was over, they had 6 Japanese bodies. They'd lost one of their own. Morales pulled the dog tags from Lowell's neck and tucked them into his pocket. "You did good, kid," he muttered. Then he reloaded. That night, the men slept under a tarp strung between 2 pines. It wasn't sleep, really. Just silence. Morales sat awake, polishing the carbine in low firelight. It was scratched, chipped, and blackened at the barrel. He remembered holding it for the first time on the docks at Pearl Harbor. He had mocked it. Everyone had. Now he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. "Sir," one of the replacements asked, hesitantly, "you ever wonder if they'll give us something better?" Morales looked up. "Better for what?" "I don't know. Stopping power, I guess." Morales shook his head. "She doesn't stop them. You do." By late April, American and Filipino forces had sealed the northern escape routes. Yamashita was still alive, still hiding somewhere in the mountains. The remnants of his army, down from 250,000 to less than 50,000, were starving, diseased, and desperate. The Americans didn't always fire on sight anymore. In many cases, the Japanese came out of the caves carrying white cloth, their uniforms tattered and rotting. They still feared tanks, flamethrowers, grenades, but it was the little rifle in the hands of tired, sunburned men that killed them the most. In a ravine outside Ifugao, a Japanese officer was captured after surrendering with 6 of his men. During interrogation, he was asked what surprised him most about the Americans. "Not the artillery, not the aircraft. The small rifle," he said. He mimed a short weapon, shouldering it like a carbine. "Fires very fast, always aimed. It does not stop." By May, the war in Luzon was nearly done. But the carbine's job wasn't. There was still Okinawa, still Iwo Jima, still the terrible shadow of the Japanese homeland. The jungle gun born for clerks, laughed at by officers, feared by the enemy, had followed them through it all. Through city, through jungle, through mountain, and it was still waiting. September 20, 1954 Manila Harbor, Philippines. The bay was calm. The waters, once blackened by oil fires and floating wrecks, now sparkled with late-morning Sunday. The skyline of Manila remained shattered, the scars of February, still visible in its gutted cathedrals and burnt neighborhoods. Yet, the city breathed again. Filipino children played in alleys. Laundry fluttered between bombed-out walls. And in the harbor, American landing ships sat idle, their decks still stained with the footprints of war. News had come over the radio just hours before. The Japanese had surrendered. On the decks of the USS Missouri, thousands of miles away in Tokyo Bay, the ink had dried. The empire had fallen. The war for now was over. Sergeant Joe Morales stood beside a field radio truck at Pier 7, leaning against the fender with a cigarette between his lips and his M1 Carbine slung over one shoulder. It was still with him, the same weapon he had carried from Leyte to Luzon, through jungle, ruin, and mountain. And though the fighting had stopped, he hadn't let go of it. "Feels wrong," Private Adams muttered beside him. "Just ending like that. No more orders. No more marching." Morales didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on the cargo ship being unloaded nearby. Men were carrying crates, supplies, not ammo. Rice, canned peaches, medicine, tools. Rebuilding kits, not killing kits. "You know," Morales finally said, "I used to think this thing was temporary. A stopgap." He patted the carbine gently, like one would a dog that had just come through a storm. "Back in Bataan, they said it was for cooks, for radio guys, not for us." Adams grinned. Guess we proved them wrong. Morales nodded slowly. No, it did. In the days that followed the surrender, U.S. troops began collecting weapons across the Philippines from surrendering garrisons, isolated jungle units, and even the hands of POWs. Japanese rifles were stacked in pyramids. Swords were sheathed and boxed. Ammunition was tossed into pits and burned. But the Americans held on to their carbines. They carried them on patrols in Manila, guarding prisoners, overseeing food distribution, escorting medical convoys. Many didn't even realize they were still gripping them like lifelines, as if the jungle would suddenly roar back to life. Old habits were hard to break. In a refugee camp north of the city, Morales watched a Japanese officer surrender his sword to a Filipino guerrilla. The guerrilla, a wiry man named Santos who had fought alongside Morales in the city battles, took it with both hands and bowed stiffly. His M1 Carbine was slung across his back. It was an image Morales would never forget. The weapon of a modern revolution, crossing the shoulders of a man who had fought with machetes and stolen bullets. Later, Santos would tell him, "The carbine gave us our voice. For 3 years we could only hide. When we got these, we could speak again." Back at a temporary American headquarters in San Fernando, officers drafted their final after-action reports, stamped and filed under infantry weapons, performance. M1 Carbine, reliable in humid and jungle conditions, excellent for close-quarters combat and patrol work, superior handling in mountainous and urban terrain, reduced lethality at extended range or against armored targets. Overall, impact, decisive in tactical engagements. Some wanted to phase it out after the war, now that the Garand had proven itself and submachine guns had their place. Others suggested refining the cartridge, redesigning the stock. But among the enlisted, the debate was over. Morales sat with his squad on the steps of the Manila post office, what remained of it. They passed around a bottle of watered-down gin. Nobody was celebrating. They were just there watching the sun set over a city they had helped take back. Adams pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket and scratched onto the cracked marble beside them. She wasn't big, but she never blinked. Underneath, he drew the outline of a carbine. "Reckon she'll be in museums one day?" someone asked. Morales shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe some kid'll get handed one in another war, and it'll save his life like it did ours." They sat in silence a while longer, and then Morales stood, stretched his sore back, and slung the M1 Carbine one final time. "All right," he said. "Let's go home." By the war's end, over 6.1 million M1 Carbines had been produced, more than any other U.S. firearm of World War II. It had been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed. But it was there when the Philippines bled, when Manila burned, when mountains swallowed men whole. It was there when the shooting stopped. It was the weapon that spoke when everything else fell silent. And for countless American infantrymen, Filipino guerrillas, and Allied soldiers across the Pacific, it wasn't just a rifle. It was a reason they lived.